if the swamp can steal a national election, what hope do we have that the swamp is actually going to ever come to grips with reforming the COMEX and reforming the manipulation? What we're witnessing is perhaps the greatest travesty in the history of democracy. And we're going to get into this when we talk about Jefferson. So the history of England, the history of America has been securing rights through violence. Now, since Gandhi and since Martin Luther King, there's been a doctrine in the Western world that we don't settle disputes or political grievances through violence. It must be through non-violent means. So how do you do that? It's through political participation, whether it's about actually engaging the political process like I did on the cash transaction ban, whether it's utilizing the courts, or whether it is actually voting a government out that you don't agree with. And obviously, if they can manipulate election outcomes through breaches of state law, the Constitution, or whether it's through some of these Dominion voting machines, how can you actually change public policy if you can't change the government or if you can't actually speak out? And obviously, big tech censorship is a huge issue that is so key to the founding of America. America's supreme document is not the Constitution, it's the Declaration of Independence, and you have God-given rights which sit above the Constitution, and you have the right to revolution if the government doesn't actually adhere to protecting those rights. That is the essence of America.
This is Dunnigan Kaiser, founder of Liberty and Finance. I'm now a licensed gold and silver dealer with Miles Franklin. Call me directly for the physical gold and silver that you need at the best price with personalized, private service from one of the oldest and best respected companies in the business. 30 years strong, A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, 0 complaints, licensed and bonded, insured delivery or vault storage or IRAs, excellent prices, privacy and confidentiality, pay by check, money order, ACH or wire, satisfaction guaranteed. Call me directly at 419-819-9209 or my associate at 310-562-6400 or email us at kaiser@milesfranklin.com. Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We have a returning guest of great renown. This is John Adams. He is an analyst and the chief economist at Good as Gold Australia. He joins us this Tuesday, January 5th, 2021. John, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
We wanted to get you back on for a number of reasons. You have been with us several times throughout 2020 talking about the specter of a Australian $10,000 cash ban. We've talked a lot with our subscribers about why a cash ban of any kind or a cashless society is dangerous to the ordinary person. We'd like to get your progress report from the trenches because it sounds like there's been major progress made in the fight against the $10,000 cash ban. We'll also touch later then on the gold and silver markets versus crypto, the U.S. election, and what basically, is it unprecedented what's happening, or do we have some precedents to fall back on? And also the right of the people to alter or to abolish the government as asserted by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, and how that may apply to Australians as well. So if we could first take a look at the Australian $10,000 cash ban, remind people what was in the works, what you did about it, and what's come of it.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So in about July of 2019, the government via the Department of the Treasury, the federal department, released its working paper and draft legislation to make it illegal to conduct a $10,000 cash transaction in Australia. And the penalty was going to be 2 years jail, maximum penalty of 2 years jail, or a fine of $25,200. So it had been proposed by the Prime Minister in 2018, but we only got to see the detail in 2019. And then from that, we started doing a series of shows. So Martin North and myself on the Interest of the People, which is our YouTube channel, we galvanized a grassroots effort to inform the public that this legislation was now being put out for public consultation by the Treasury. So we got an unprecedented number, about 3,500 submissions to respond overwhelmingly negative against the proposal. Then what happened was it went to federal parliament and it was introduced by the government. and initially it went straight away to a Senate inquiry. And in that inquiry, I put in a detailed submission, and there was a whole host of people around the country that basically said that the arguments of the government for why they wanted to ban cash transactions was about the black economy, tax evasion, criminal networks, etc. Our argument was that the evidence that this ban would actually work for the black economy was quite weak, drawing on European evidence. We also said that there was, in our view, a nefarious agenda by our central bank around negative interest rates, and obviously the cashless society, QE, unconventional monetary policy. That was the reason why they wanted to start to move the country in this direction of eliminating cash. And we also said that if the government was committed to tackling the black economy, there was other policy options available for them, and banning cash transactions was not the it wasn't the most effective manner to go about addressing that particular issue. So we put in a range of submissions, and then what happened was that there was two sets of hearings. There was a set of hearings in late 2019, and then in January 2020, just before the pandemic started to break out, there was a hearing in Sydney at the end of January, about just over 12 months ago. I had the opportunity to testify. I was invited by the committee, so I basically outlined my opposition to the legislation. That's a recording, that testimony is up on our YouTube channel in the interest of the people. If anyone wants to have a look at what I proposed to the committee back then and the questions that were asked by the senators. Then from there, in February, we had a report that came out, and the report from the committee was a complete whitewash, basically dismissed all of our arguments, basically said that they didn't endorse the legislation holus bolus, but they said that if a number of changes were made, that the parliament should pass the legislation. So from that's when COVID-19 happened in February, and basically the lockdowns and everything that we saw across the world started to take over. And basically this legislation had been placed on the back burner, and we really didn't get any notification from the government what they were going to do with this. And this was just sitting around, and I had made a series of phone calls to people in Parliament. I called the Minister's office and said, well, are you going to push ahead with this? You haven't responded to the committee report, etc. What are you going to do? So we came to work with a particular senator where he introduced a motion to have the legislation removed from the official agenda of Parliament. So in November, there was an article that just came out of the blue saying that the government had no intention to move on this issue in 2020, but they reserved the right to maybe come back to this in 2021. So we thought, knowing that there was a lot of opposition within the government to this, because we had burned the phones down in Parliament and everyone in Parliament knew how strong the public reaction to this was, we worked with a particular Senator, Senator Roberts, who introduced a motion to say that the legislation should be removed from the official agenda of the Senate. And the reason why that was important was that obviously we wanted to flesh out the government's position. If the government wanted to come back to it in 2021, they would still want it on the notice paper. But if it was a real commitment that they were going to walk away from it, they would agree to take it off. And what we were hearing was that the backbench of the government was completely against the legislation, but the minister didn't want to admit defeat. So this is why this was just sitting there, and there was no statement from the government about what they were going to do. So on the morning of when the motion was proposed, the discussions will happen behind the scenes, and it was unanimously agreed by the Australian Senate to remove the notice paper. And then once that happened, I notified several journalists, and the journalists started making phone calls. And there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, and I sent you the link, and you may want to put it up and
you bet I will,
for the viewers to see. So a senator in the government said it is dead. That is the direct quote. It's not just one dead; it's three deads, dead. And that was basically the final nail in the coffin on this legislation. And so it took us about 15, 16 months to kill it. but it was an important victory to reserve the right, the freedom to use physical legal tender in Australia unrestricted by criminal sanction. And to the best of my knowledge, Australia is only the second country in the world to have achieved this behind Germany. So a cash transaction ban was proposed in Germany in 2016, and there was a strong public reaction to that, and the German government dropped it, whereas in a whole host of other European countries like Italy, France, Spain, etc., they brought in cash transaction bans of very low amounts, like 100 euros or 300 euros, etc. We were successful in killing it. So that was a very big win, and we still have some economic freedom left here in Australia.
This is a theme that is only going to get more vital as we go forward. Many people, if you walk up and down the street and talk to people, I don't think they have any visibility of this. Some people recognize that electronic transactions in some ways can be more low touch. They can be more convenient in some ways. They can get things done quicker in some cases. They also may be aware, some people are, that very large cash transactions, like in the U.S., $10,000 or more, for a long time have been reportable. They're not illegal. They're reported. You have to fill out a form. But that's often been a concern to people who point that the direction that's heading is away from the freedom to do what we choose with the fruits of our own earnings that we have amassed on our own. That people being able to spend and maintain their own privacy, their own liberty, that sort of thing. You stood up against this because it's so important. And number one, you stood up against this onslaught of encroachment of natural rights or civil rights of people. But secondly, you demonstrated that people can make a difference. I mean, regardless of the topic, the fact that by getting involved, finding out what is the motivation behind this, how effective would the legislation be at really addressing the real root cause, just facing up to the truth about it, you really did a service for the people of Australia, for people all around the world, by setting an example that people can make a difference if they get involved and speak up and be tenacious and get the ear. That's one thing that you demonstrated through this, is getting the ear of the people who need to be involved to ally with you, align with you, and get things moved where the decision-making actually happens. So our hats are off to you for this. Are there next steps? I mean, this sounds like a great victory for freedom, for people's restoration of their rights, or prevention of encroachment on those rights. Are there any next steps that you see that need to come from this, or are those the main takeaways, that cashless society is a danger and you can make a difference if you stand up and speak up?
Yes. So I'll probably make 2 points on that. Now, there's a video circulating around the internet for the last, I think, 1 or 2 weeks by Catherine Austin-Fitts, and she talks about how the global elite are trying to use COVID-19 to transition the monetary system to effectively the Chinese social credit score system. So when you can eliminate cash, when you can push everyone into a central bank digital currency, and once you can start to put legal controls on people to say, if you don't take a vaccine, if you don't do A, if you don't do B, well, then you can't spend your money, you can't take your money, you can't do a whole host of things. So there's a big fear, I think, in particularly in the Western world, that's where policymakers want us to go. We want to be a replica of the CCP. And so obviously this was a big defeat for the government, because we've put a very big dent into those sort of plans. And, one of the big things that a lot of people, I think, around the world haven't come to grips with is we are like central banks are trapped. I mean, they've lowered interest rates to zero, in some cases negative. We've got the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world globally. Australia has the biggest household debt bubble in Australian history. There can be no normalization of interest rates, because that's going to pop the bubble, and we would have the biggest deflationary depression in world history. And so they're obviously starting to think, well, we're trapped. We can't raise interest rates. We need to lower interest rates more. We need to restrict how people spend money, because we need to keep this global debt bubble going. And that's what I think some of this motivation for some of these ideas are coming from. And so we've obviously achieved a big victory there. And I should say that, to the best of my knowledge, in Australian history terms, this was the first defeat of a federal bill in federal parliament through a grassroots YouTube campaign. So never before had people, because the fact that in the interest of the people, we led the coverage. The mainstream media caught up to us, but we were the first ones out, and we did the work. We actually went through the policy documents, we wrote the submissions, we examined what the government was saying, and we found relevant evidence to refute that. And so when I was able to testify, I was able to go through chapter and verse to say, well, this is why the government's wrong, and here's why the legislation should be endorsed. So it's obviously very good to use social media and new techniques to communicate with people and get people involved, but still, you still have to do the policy work, and you still have to come up with a cogent argument as to why a proposal by government is either right or wrong. So we're able to do that. And now, in terms of next steps, now one of the, I think, things that we've discussed in the past is this issue of bail-in of retail deposits. It's happened in Cyprus in 2012-13. And I know that a lot of Americans, a lot of Europeans, Australians are very concerned about the safety of retail deposits. Well, so last year there was a proposal by, again, Senator Roberts in the Australian Senate to close a loophole in the law that we believed allowed the bail-in of retail deposits. Now, there was an inquiry. I wrote the lead submission, a 32-page detailed submission, the most definitive account of our concern. The committee didn't allow for any hearings, and they wrote a report which again was a complete whitewash. And it is the same committee, the Senate Economics Committee. It was a complete whitewash. Now, the legislation was then taken to the Senate for a vote. And the legislation was defeated, but behind the scenes, a number of government senators were going to actually go against the government on this bill. So they basically said, in order not to embarrass the government, how about we come up with some sort of compromise, particularly in 2021. So after the bill was defeated on the floor of the Senate, there has been a couple of meetings behind the scenes in late 2020. We've been led to believe that the government, here's what the Treasury officials have said behind the scenes. It was never our intention to bail in retail deposits in Australia, even though that here's the thing: Australia signed a global agreement under the G20 that we commit to bail in. The New Zealand Central Bank has put in a regime explicitly saying deposits are on the table. The United States, the European Union, the UK have also deposits are on the table. And for some reason, Australia is saying, well, for us, the deposits are not on the table.
Yeah, let me just interrupt there. Let me reinforce that point with you. So everyone in the U.S. who's watching this, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 explicitly says that ordinary savings account and checking account deposits that we have in the bank are unsecured loans to the bank that places us not in the owner of those funds anymore, but an unsecured creditor to the bank. So we've done some shows on that, but just to reinforce people, the U.S. law that quietly got slipped in called the Consumer and Borrower Protection Act, which always means the opposite of what the actual intent of it is, puts depositors on the hook and says the money that you have in the bank is not your money anymore. It's now the bank's, and they can do with it as they will. And if they need it, they can access it as part of their balance sheet, and you can stand in line and wait behind all the other creditors. So just wanted to reinforce what you're saying there. People think, well, lucky that's only happening in Australia, not in the U.S. No, it's already on the books in the U.S. So go ahead, John.
Yes, that's correct. Yep. So when we went through the inquiry process, the government officially, and particularly the bureaucrats, said that the proposal to close the loophole was not necessary because there was no issue. Now, behind the scenes, in late December, after the legislation had been defeated in the Senate to close the loophole, the officials said to several senators, it was never our intention to bail in deposits in Australia, but we can see how legally that can be interpreted. So even though publicly they said there's nothing to see here, they said some of these legal arguments do have some merit. So now, because they say their intention is not to bail in retail deposits in Australia, they have committed to coming forward with amendments to the Banking Act in 2021, which is going to address some of the legal arguments we put forward about this loophole that we have concerns about. So we have to wait until March, April to see the first cut of that draft, and we will get some of our legal people to look at what the government is proposing on that. But it seems that we're going to have a second victory on that issue of bail-in in 2021. So we'll have to obviously wait for the fine print to come through, but we've got some very good points on that. And again, when you get some smart experts to put in the serious work to engage in the parliamentary process, to get a wide range of Australians engaged in public policy, you can start to move the needle in federal parliament. And perhaps I know that Americans in general are a lot more politically active than Australians, but there is obviously, you're going through the US election now. There's a lot of pressure being put on Republicans to critically assess what has happened in the election, and that's actually having an impact in Washington. I have some sources in Washington saying that the grassroots is really moving the needle in terms of the Republican Party, and I would say the same thing here. Donald Rumsfeld said the world is ruled by those who show up, and in 2019 and 2020. A lot of Australians showed up on the cash transaction ban and bail-in, and it looks like we're going to have a couple of wins. And I think that's significant, because before our win on the cash ban, a lot of Australians were quite sceptical as to what ability can people have on the political process. So we can show that it's been done. Now it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time, but we can show that that it can work. And I've got another fight coming up in the next 6 weeks, and we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson and its relevance in the Australian context.
Yeah, we want to talk more about that, but I think this just underscores the criticality that people know when something smells rotten when it's explained to them clearly. It's distressingly easy to have things be spun or whitewashed or denied or ignored or not talked about by the powers that be. But when you have someone who's got the know-how to dig in and really run something to ground, look up the historical precedents, explain the fallacies or the loopholes, and then make it accessible to the ordinary person, they've got it, and they'll give you their backing. But the role that you and Martin North have played in this, in the interest of the people, has really been catalyzing in that regards, and it's encouraging also to me that you've found alliances, how to find sympathetic members of Parliament who can then take actions and to spread that awareness on the inside to help affect those policy changes.
Absolutely.
We want to circle back in just a minute to talk more about both. You mentioned the U.S. election and Thomas Jefferson's principles. First, could we look at the silver and gold markets and what you're seeing happening and developing there, and especially in the light of the burgeoning dollar alternative universe, which is led arguably at the moment, at least nominally, by the cryptoverse. We certainly had an interesting behavior today in the U.S. of after seeing all-time highs, like for a week in a row of several cryptocurrencies, we saw like a 10% pullback today, and we saw gold and silver starting to move, which haven't really moved significantly in maybe a month or two. But can you talk to us about what the big picture is, the major factors that you think are important for people to be aware of in gold, silver, and cryptos right now?
Sure. So I've been involved in the silver market in particular. So I'm very big on silver, more so than gold. I've been studying this market and been buying silver for about 3-4 years. Obviously, I'm the chief economist for As Good as Gold Australia, so I work for a bullion dealership, and I've been with them for about 2.5 years, and really educating the public about sound money, about what happens when central banks print a lot of money. And obviously, I know that in terms of yourself with your program and your alliance with Miles Franklin, you've been doing effectively the same thing. I mean, the history of gold and silver and what happens when you have fiat currency is pretty well established. What I think is significant about 2020, I'd say a couple of points. The first one is that in about I think April, I came out and said that we are going to head into stagflation. And stagflation is effectively low to negative economic growth, high unemployment, rising prices. And so obviously we saw unemployment shoot up both in America as well as in the Australia, but at the same time, huge money printing. And in that environment, I've just issued a newsletter to our clients in Australia with As Good as Gold. When you look across the asset classes, it has been a very strong year for silver. Silver's gone up in Australian dollar terms about 31% in the last 12 months, and in US dollar terms, it's gone up 50%. Now, gold in US dollar terms has gone up about 27.5%, whereas in Australian dollar terms, it went up 13%. But when you compare it to the traditional asset classes of cash, fixed income, which is effectively bonds, property, the share market, I should say that on the share market, our what we call the ASX 200, the 200 top stocks, over a 12-month period, it actually fell 0.3%. Now, the S&P 500 had a strong year, I think, from memory, about 13-14%. But compared to silver, in particular, the traditional asset classes did not perform. And so those people advocating for bullion, whether it's yourself or me or Miles Franklin, Peter Schiff, etc. I mean, our investment thesis has largely played out in 2020, and those who positioned early in the silver market, particularly with some of these low prices, I mean, it has been a very good year in terms of last year. Now, going forward, and we talked about this just before we started recording, the world is stuck. We have these ultra low interest rates. We can't normalize interest rates, otherwise we're going to have this huge depression. So as the economy, so I'm expecting more lockdowns in 2021. Yes, we're actually going to interview a professor who's been studying COVID-19 for the last 12 months around the clock, and we do expect to see some more waves of COVID-19 come to Australia in 2021. I think that you may start to see some additional explosion in cases in America also in 2021. So I don't think the pandemic or the lockdowns are going to end anytime soon. So governments will have to do a better job at managing the virus and how do you have an open economy with a pandemic at the same time. So I don't think we're going to go back to a full open economy. And obviously, there's a whole host of people who are struggling. We've seen huge stimulus packages in 2020 from both the American government as well as the Australian government, and that's all being financed through money printing. So I do expect to see more stimulus coming forward in 2021, and I think there's there's a whole host in the gold and silver community. Like in the last 2 or 3 days, there've been Craig Hempke, for example. He's been talking about how the US Federal Reserve is about to go Weimar. So obviously, when we get into this period of the cycle, I think the acceleration of money printing is going to ramp up. That should be, again, a very positive environment for gold and silver prices, and I do expect those prices to go forward, to go higher forward. Now, in terms of crypto, crypto was the only asset class that did outperform gold and silver in 2020. Bitcoin in Australian dollar terms was up about, I think, 250%. Ethereum was up more than 300%. Some of the other coins were, I think Litecoin was up about 120%. So some of these coins, they did perform. Now, I should say that some coins had a huge crash in late December, Ripple and some of these other altcoins, because the SEC has filed in federal court to say that some of these coins are actually securities, and the way they have been marketed and sold in America are actually a violation of federal law. And so that lawsuit has collapsed a number of coins. And so some of these coins are still up over the 12-month period, but they're only up maybe 30% as opposed to 300%. So there could be further litigation from federal regulators in America, which could have a huge impact about some of these coins. Now, I've had a number of gold and silver clients come to me in the last 12 months asking about crypto, and I've always held the view that to provide some very accurate analysis about cryptocurrencies. It's not just about actually having a solid understanding about economics, which I think you need. It's also, I think, having a detailed knowledge about cryptology, because there's a whole bunch of coins. These coins do various things, and I just don't have an IT background, so I couldn't tell you the difference between a Bitcoin versus an Ethereum versus Litecoin. What do they do? What are their properties? The other thing is these coins never have been really tested in a crisis, so I can't give any historical data points to say that in the last crisis this is how these coins performed. Whereas we have a track record for gold and silver for 5,000 years, and that's why I was able to place more confidence in what I know was more certain. So there are some people who have performed, who have earned a lot of money in cryptos over the last 12 months, and obviously good for them. And I do have a very small amount, but the mainstay for me has been silver with a bit of gold, and that has performed very strongly relative to the traditional asset classes. Now, the other point I want to make about gold and silver is that you have had a number of experts on your channel over the last 2-3 years talking about the manipulation of the market, whether it's Ted Butler or Bill Murphy or Craig Hemke or Rob Kirby or some of these other guys. It's very clear that these markets are corrupt, and the CFTC hasn't done the job of actually fixing these markets. And we saw some litigation last year with JP Morgan and the Department of Justice about spoofing. But the key thing that I've been very nervous about the broader situation on manipulation is it's clear to me the US election has been stolen from Trump. And I've got a whole host of reasons why I believe that. Since November 3rd, I've been looking at this election around the clock. And to me, it's a coup d'etat. And it's organized by not just the Democrats, a whole host of Republicans are involved. And then you start to see basically little action from the DOJ, former Attorney General Barr, when he was there, basically said there's nothing to see here. The FBI has basically been reluctant. The courts haven't been looked at. And so to my mind, and I think this is important for gold and silver investors to think about, is if the swamp can steal a national election, what hope do we have that the swamp is actually going to ever come to grips with reforming the COMEX and reforming the manipulation? Now, going into 2021, 2022, I do still believe gold and silver prices are going to be higher from where we are today, purely because of the amount of money in the system. But obviously, you've got Big Swear and you've got a whole bunch of other people out there saying that the fair market value, and also you've got people like Leonard Zhang, who you've interviewed in the past. What is the fair market value for gold and silver in a free market? It could be $9,000, $10,000 US gold per ounce. It could be $600-700 US an ounce for silver. If the swamp wins against Trump and Biden is the president, I think effectively in the next 4 years, there's little chance that you're going to see gold and silver go to its fair market value, because there is just so much inability to actually apply the rule of law. So that's why I think the election is so important for the gold and silver market, because effectively is America, does it adhere to the rule of law? Do you actually have institutions that actually deal with criminality, whether it's in the financial markets or whether it's in terms of the elections, or is it just a lawless a lawless group of mafia groups, basically, running America to the way that they want? And so that's why I think, I've been very focused on the election, and and you may want to put up my tweet. I put up a tweet yesterday, and it was retweeted by General Michael Flynn, and it's already had 2 million views in the last 24 hours. And so I'm very engaged on this issue. I have some contacts in Washington that I've been speaking to over the last couple of weeks, and we'll have to see how that situation plays out.
That's another area we wanted to get into with you, because first of all, I have to hand it to you again, because not only were you on top of what's going on in Australia, but you were even getting involved with writing letters like to every member of the Michigan state legislature and that sort of thing about irregularities in the voting that happened there and that sort of thing. So it's your level of concern, your tenacity of depth of getting into the details of things and to reaching out to those who are in the position of responsibility, frankly, duty to their constituents, to stand up and show some backbone and stand up for the republic, for truth, for a constitutional civil society has been commendable, and we just thank you for that. Now, specifically, though, you mentioned this in passing earlier that there are many things on the line here. For example, the cash ban threatens our freedom. In this case, the ability to even speak up and speak out and take action against things can be heavily and is being heavily censored. We've had dozens of independent media platforms be deplatformed who've had to go over to alternate venues in order to get their message out. You just recently presented data that indicates shadow banning of your Twitter account, that sort of thing. So can you talk to us just briefly about the risk that people are having to brave that risk in order to continue to speak out at times like this, and why the outcome of which direction we're going to go as a society could mean this might be freedom's last stand in terms of our ability to have free speech and to exercise our free speech?
What we're witnessing is perhaps the greatest travesty in the history of democracy. And we're going to get into this when we talk about Jefferson. So the history of England, the history of America has been securing rights through violence. Now, since Gandhi and since Martin Luther King, there's been a doctrine in the Western world that we don't settle disputes or political grievances through violence. It must be through non-violent means. So how do you do that? It's through political participation, whether it's about actually engaging the political process like I did on the cash transaction ban, whether it's utilizing the courts, or whether it is actually voting a government out that you don't agree with. And obviously, if they can manipulate election outcomes through breaches of state law, the Constitution, or whether it's through some of these Dominion voting machines, how can you actually change public policy if you can't change the government, or if you can't actually speak out? And obviously, big tech censorship is a huge issue. And Trump tried to remove the Section 230 exemption on the tech oligarchs, and basically Congress overrode when he vetoed the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which basically would have removed this exemption from litigation that YouTube and Twitter and Facebook have, and then Congress overrode that veto. So there's a huge battle for free speech. And obviously, the mainstream media in America is completely corrupt. To me, a lot of the things that they say just don't stack up to be anything remotely truthful. So, how do you find the truth? Well, in the last 5 years, we've been going into alternative media. I mean, people who want to speak out, like yourself and me, we set up our own channels and we garner an audience. But really, to actually figure out, well, what's going on and how do we get accurate information, is through some of these other venues which the traditional media can't control. And now they're basically cracking down on us and basically, trying to stop us being able to communicate. And that has huge implications for a functioning democracy, look at it in terms of functioning society. So if you can't discuss, if you can't assemble, if you can't engage, what can you really do? And so, maybe not a lot of Australians appreciate this. A lot of the Bill of Rights that the founders introduced in 1791 as amendments to the Constitution, these were protections around violations that they saw a lot of European monarchs implement, and said, well, people have the freedom to speak, to assemble, to have weaponry, to defend their rights. And government can't take these things away. And slowly but surely, these things are being eroded in America, in Australia, and the ability to get around the system and actually engage with your fellow citizen about charting a new way forward for your own country, that's being stopped as well. So that's where I think all of this is on the line.
Now, something else you just mentioned rang true, that for people who want to make sure that we don't lose touch with you, because some of these independent media sites got very abruptly deplatformed. Folks, if that were to happen to any of us who are trying to speak out about this and the importance, the criticality of this, make sure you get on our free mailing list. Go to libertyandfinance.com. Over in the left-hand margin at libertyandfinance.com, put your name and email address, click subscribe me or send me up, and we'll get you a confirmation email. Once you're confirmed, you'll be getting our all free email 3 times a week with all of our guests, including John Adams. Any of the links, he provided copious links that will be included in the description of the video so you can get details and dig into the facts, because John is a stickler for details and original sources. You'll see that information in our free newsletter. Wanted to make sure people are aware of that. Now, you mentioned gently there that there's a new tradition from Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr. saying that this all has to be done peacefully. Is that a limitation that can't be surmounted then in some cases? And what about Jefferson's Declaration of Independence? What lessons do you think might be still accessible to people in Australia if they need to?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the important thing about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, and he was the original drafter before the Continental Congress actually made some amendments, is, one of the things I have to wonder, and I'm really interested in your opinion about this, Dunnigan, is do Americans actually understand what America is all about? So I've had I've been issuing some tweets critical of Jenna Ellis, who's on the President Trump's campaign legal team, and she keeps on saying that the Constitution is the supreme law in America, and we must follow the Constitution. And if Biden is if he becomes president via the constitution process, we just have to suck it up, even though we know it's all based on fraud. Well, that's not actually America. I mean, the Constitution is the supreme law, but to my mind, it's not the supreme document. The supreme document is the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration says, and I've just got this in front of me. It says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter, abolish it, and to institute new government. So the key thing about the Declaration of Independence is it said that humans have natural rights that come from the Creator. Now, here's the thing. So some people think that Jefferson was an atheist. He wasn't an atheist. He just didn't believe in organized Christian religion like it was in Europe. But he did believe in a Christian God. So we have natural rights that come from God, and these rights sit above any law, the U.S. Constitution involved. And if government becomes destructive and doesn't protect those rights, we have the right to revolution. And that is basically what Jefferson articulated. So now, obviously, a lot of Americans are not being told this. A lot of Americans are basically saying we must not be violent. But the essence of America is, if things get so bad, you have the right to revolution. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but there's a famous quote by Jefferson that he wrote in the 19th century about the importance of the blood being spilled of tyrants and patriots. And that's the way how you keep everything in check. So that is so key to the founding of America. America's supreme document is not the Constitution, it's the Declaration of Independence. And you have God-given rights which sit above the Constitution, and you have the right to revolution if the government doesn't actually adhere to protecting those rights. That is the essence of America. And I think even people inside President Trump's own legal team fail to understand what America is all about. So that's the key thing there. Now, how is this relevant in Australia? So there's a current inquiry underway by the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, and they're looking at extremist movements and radicalisation in Australia. Now, since 9/11, Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism has been a big problem in the West, both in America, Europe, UK, Australia, etc. Now, in Australia, they've been saying that, so our intelligence main service, ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, they have said that the biggest problem in the last 4 years has been this explosion of so-called extreme right-wing extremism. And so back in 2016, they said 10 to 15% of their caseload was looking at these far-right people. And again, there's no definition about this, but we saw a lone wolf attack by an Australian in Christchurch, New Zealand last year, where he basically went into a mosque and killed a lot of Muslims in a mosque. And that was seen to be he was a white supremacist, neo-Nazi, etc. So that's what they're now talking about as this is the big problem emerging in Western world countries. And basically, ASIO has said on the record that it was 10 to 15% of the counterterrorism caseload in 2016. It's now up to 40%. So in terms of Australia, they're saying that a whole bunch of young white Australians talking on social media like Facebook are now talking openly about violence against the government. And that's what they need to get on top of, and that's what this inquiry is. Now, I'm not entirely sure about American law, but under Australian law, any discussion of violence, any urging of violence, any conspiracy to commit violence, any performance of violence against the government, our Queen, the Queen of Australia, the Governor General, her representative, or the government of the day or the Parliament, it's completely illegal. You can't discuss it, organise it, urge it, etc. Now, under the status of Australian law, Jefferson, in which he said we can basically alter or abolish the government, institute new government if the government's so corrupt, that's illegal under Australian law. And I dare say that if Jefferson was alive in Australia today, he would be defined as a right-wing extremist. I think if the Australian Parliament ever said that formally, I think Americans would take great offence to Australia labelling Jefferson in that sort of manner. But that's what our law effectively says. So I'm now putting together a detailed submission to this inquiry, and the submissions are due on the 12th of February 2021, and basically saying that, yes, in general, violence against the government, against the Queen, should be illegal, but there is this situation that if things get so bad, we have the right to revolution in Australia. And so there's this particular legal process or legal argument that I'm working through now, going through a whole host of legal and historical sources. So our Constitution says nothing about natural rights. We don't have a founding document we didn't have a revolution to start Australia, so we don't have a Declaration of Independence. So our founding documents are silent about natural rights and about the right to revolution. But basically, those who created Australia back in 1901, they thought themselves as Englishmen and part of the British Empire. So because of that, the only guidance we can have to see whether we actually have rights to rebel against the government or the Queen is through English history and English law. And the funny thing is that that's what the Americans relied on. So in 1776, Americans thought of themselves as Englishmen. Under the English Constitution, their rights guaranteed under Magna Carta had been denied by King George III in Parliament. And in order to restore those rights that they thought they were entitled to, that was the basis for the revolution. So in 1765, 11 years before the revolution, John Adams wrote a dissertation about English law, and basically says that, if you look at the 17th century with the trial of King Charles I, King Charles I was executed by what they constructed as the High Court of Justice after the English Civil War, and he was charged with the crime of treason against the people. This is the first time in English history that a king was tried for treason against the people. So Adams and other writers in America relied on this trial and other writings like John Locke to say that there is the right to lawful rebellion under English tradition and custom, and that's what the legal basis for the revolution in America was. And so in Australia, there is no discussion in academia. No one's ever made the case about Jefferson's declaration in the Australian context. So I'm basically putting together an argument forward to say that given that we are under the British Crown, we have rights dating back at least 800 years to Magna Carta, and you can't take those rights away through Australian law. And by saying that violence against the government under all circumstances is illegal, there's a constitutional question here, and no one's ever made the argument. So that's what I'm been researching for the last month, and hopefully we can defend the legacy of Jefferson here in Australia, and see if we can move the needle in terms of where Parliament is heading. Because what I'm afraid Parliament's going to do is to say we've got this problem of right-wing extremists. We need to have more criminal sanctions. We need to have more surveillance by the government against individual Australians. We need to crack down on platforms like Facebook, because that's where these extremists are talking about. And we need to have more so-called de-radicalization programs. So we need more federal spending. So that's what I think the committee is going to recommend. And it's completely wrong. There was a report by an Australian university only 3 months ago where they talked about far-right extremists in Australia. You and I, Dunnigan, would be classified under. So this was basically written by a whole bunch of Marxists at an Australian university, and they basically said if you don't accept the mainstream narrative on a whole host of things, then you're a conspiracy theorist, and conspiracy theories is the mainstay of far-right extremists. So even though you and I personally are not violent, the fact that we don't accept the mainstream narrative, we don't accept what government is telling us about the economy or gold and silver, whatever the case may be, this report says there is a creeping threat of Australians talking in ways that are detrimental to political and social norms in Australia. Well, what the left want people to do is their Marxist and utopian vision of Australia or the United States with the Democrat Party, that is the mainstream understanding of the world. And if you disagree with that, you're an extremist, and we need to crack down on your free speech. So that's what I am deeply concerned about in Australia. And so using Jefferson in the Declaration, I'm hoping to stop any action from the federal parliament, but also to see if we can actually get the parliament to recognize that there are some traditions and conventions and customs from English history which still have relevance for Australia in 2021.
I'm very excited by the tenacity that you're bringing to that. We had Dr. Edwin Vieira, a U.S. constitutional attorney, on several times on our show, most recently talking about the specific threats posed to our republic and to our civil society by the apparent illegality and corruption in the current election. And he said, what do you do if these irregularities were perpetrated by the people who then end up taking the highest, most powerful positions in the land? He said there is no constitutional remedy for that. He said there is a remedy in the Declaration of Independence, but you go to a different level of law then. So I'll include that clip in our discussion here, and a link to the video in the description. And I would encourage you to consider reaching out to Dr. Vieira as an ally in this, as he's very well studied in that and may be able to help crystallize some of the articulation of that, because he would be drawing on some of the same roots that Jefferson did as well.
Now, what is the due process system for dealing with that when the people who got away with it then end up in control of the highest offices in the country? There is no constitutional method specified for throwing these people out if they get away with fraud, and nobody, the judiciary, the Congress, the state legislatures, if they are all thwarted in overturning this criminal result. There is no due process provision in the Constitution for dealing with it. There's due process provision in the Declaration of Independence for dealing with it. But see, we go to a different level of law here.
So, well, John, you've always impressed our audience, and we have quite a few viewers in Australia as well as in the U.S. who look forward to your visits here. We're just wanting to do anything we can to help spread the word that you're bringing out and to encourage you. And thank you for sharing that victory story that you did of the $10,000 cash ban being smacked down in Australia in the name of freedom. So just thank you once again for joining us here on Liberty and Finance, and tell people how they can make sure that they stay plugged in and follow your work.
Thank you for the opportunity for talking again on your platform. So I have my own website, adamseconomics.com. I have a newsletter that I write out from time to time. I've got a whole bunch of my economic articles on that website as well. People can follow me on Twitter at Adams Economics. I've got a Facebook page. I'm on LinkedIn and Parler as well. So feel free to go to reach out to me, and happy to engage whether you're in America or in Australia.
Thank you, John, for joining us.
Thank you.
If you've decided that now is the right time for you to protect your family's financial future by acquiring physical precious metals, gold and silver, I'm delighted to let you know that I have now become a licensed dealer's representative for Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in bullion dealerships. and we can provide you with physical delivery to your personal possession or to professional vault storage or precious metals IRAs. Just email me at libertyandfinance@protonmail.com, and please include your name and phone number in your email to libertyandfinance@protonmail.com. We'll get right back with you and find out how to best meet your needs so that you can either begin or increase your acquisition of physical precious metals now and protect your family's future starting today.
To acquire gold and silver, just go to libertyandfinance.com. When the main site comes up, click on Bullion Sales. That's libertyandfinance.com, Bullion Sales. You'll see my name, Dunnigan Kaiser, my phone number, and my associate, Kaiser Johnson, his phone number, our email, libertyandfinance@protonmail.com.